What's going on, everyone? This is Fred, findmyvapes.com, and today I'm going to show you how to build your own DNA box mod. Are you sick of having the same mod as everyone else? Tired of waiting on pre-orders? Well, maybe you should build your own DNA box mod. It's not as difficult as it may seem. All right. So I know you're really excited for this, but before we go into the instructions, let's talk about what we're going to do. So this is a DNA box mod that I built myself. The cool thing about building your own box mod is that you could customize it any way you like. So for me, I decided to go with a swirl paint job. Now, if you're interested in knowing how I did the swirl paint finish, check out this thumbnail for a full tutorial on my other channel. Now, this is a full DNA box mod, so that means it's going to have all the same features that you would expect from a DNA device. And the best part about it is that you could build one of these for less than half the cost that you would normally pay for a pre-made device out in the retail market. So let's not waste any more time, let's get right to it. Alright, so here's everything that you need to build your own DNA box mod. I will go over every item one by one and also place some links down below so that you get started on your project. The first item that you'll need is a DNA chip. Now, it doesn't matter if you choose a DNA 20 or a DNA 30. The installation process is the same. You're also going to want to pick up one of their micro USB chargers. You will need a box to put everything in. I'm going with a Hammond's 1590A enclosure. Now, this is an aluminum enclosure and everything will fit nicely inside. Now, we are using 2 LiPo batteries for this box mod. Each one of these LiPo batteries has 1200 milliamp hours of battery life. Now, we are going to wire this in parallel for a total of 2400 milliamp hours. Now, you will need a 510 connection. I'm using a top cap from an old mechanical mod that I have, but you also can use a standard 510 connector. The choice is up to you. We will need 3 switches. Now, this is going to be used for the firing, the wattage up, and the wattage down options. It will be a good idea for you to pick up some resettable fuses. Now, the DNA chip does have its own protection, but this is used as a secondary precaution. Now, if you are using a DNA 20, you want to pick up 2 of these. If you're using a DNA 30, you want to pick up 4 of them. I will explain more later on. And to connect everything together, you'll need some wire. This is some 20 gauge wire. All the connections will need to be soldered with a soldering iron, some solder, and some flux. This is going to ensure a clean, solid connection. And to protect our solder joints, you should pick up some heat shrink tubing. You should also get some double-sided tape and some 2-part epoxy. Now, we're going to use this to attach all the components to the enclosure. And finally, you want to pick up a sheet of lexan. Now, this is going to replace the metal cover that came with our enclosure. And as an optional item, I'm using some VHT nightshades. I'm going to use this to tint the clear lexan cover. Okay, so that's everything that you need, so let's get started. Okay, so let's first take a look at the box. Now, we will need to drill some holes for the top cap and the switches, but let's figure out the placement first. So let's take the battery and just place it inside the box. So now we know how much room the battery actually takes up. So we know that we have plenty of room for the top cap. We're going to probably put our fire switch right here, and there is enough space in between the side of the box and the batteries to fit our up and down switches. Now, it also looks like there's some room down here so that we could put our USB charger. So once you have the placement figured out, go ahead and drill out the holes for the top cap, the fire switch, and the up and down switches. So once you get all the holes drilled out, just go ahead and test fit all the parts. Make sure they fit nice and snug. As you can see, I have the 3 switches on the side and the adjustable 510 connection on top. So everything looks like it's coming out pretty nicely. We can start wiring the DNA chip. Okay, so let's first take a look at the chip and see what each connection does. As you can see, I've already laid out a few wires just to make it a little bit easier for you to recognize what's going on. Now, this right here is a DNA 20 chip. Now, if you are using a DNA 30, it's the exact same thing. You can still use the same diagram. So let's go over the first connection. The 2 wires right here, there's a black and a red. This one connects to your atomizer. Now, on the chip, it says out, and there's a plus and there's a minus. So this one goes to your atomizer. So make sure you have 2 wires ready for that. So this pair of blue wires goes to your firing switch. And on the board, it says fire. The pair of white wires over here, they go to your up switch, and again, it says up on the chip. This pair of yellow wires goes to your down switch, and it says down on the chip. Now the two wires here, the black and the red, this goes to your charging port. And the black and red wires over here connect to your battery. So everything is labeled on this chip, which makes installation extremely easy. Okay, so before soldering any wires, we want to cut off this onboard fire switch. The reason why we're going to cut it off is because the box that we're using has very limited space. So as you can see, this switch is higher than the rest of the board. So the easiest way to cut this off is just to take some snips and snip these two wires, these two connections, like so. Once you snip that, just start lifting the switch back and forth until the other side breaks off. Just like that. So now the board is a lot flatter. Now we don't need that switch because we have our own firing switch. So now we can start soldering the wires. Okay, so I finished soldering all the wires to the board. Now I wasn't able to get that on film, so I apologize for that. But basically what you want to do is just insert each wire into the connection, and then you want to apply some flux. You want to apply to both the wire and the board. Then you want to load up the soldering iron with solder, and all you want to do is just touch the tip of that soldering iron onto the wire, and all of that solder should just flow onto the board and make a solid connection. So once you have the board all soldered up, we can move on to the switch. Okay, so here's one of the switches. Now, as you can see, this switch has 4 legs, but we only need 2 of them. So you just want to choose one of the pairs, either this pair right here or this pair. They're going to be on the same side. Just choose one of them and then cut it off. So I'm just going to cut off 2 of these legs. And then take the remaining pair and bend it down flat, like so. We're going to then connect the wires to each one of these legs. Okay, and then apply some flux. Load up the soldering iron and then basically just paint it on. And you want to do the same thing with the other leg. Some flux and solder. Okay, so once you make your solder connection, you want to go ahead and insert your heat shrink on both legs. So when you apply heat to this, it's going to shrink and then give it a nice clean look. Now you can use a heat gun or even just a lighter. So you do want to be careful when doing this. You don't want to burn or melt anything. But just place your flame and just heat it up and you'll see it start shrinking away. So do this to all of the 3 switches. Okay, so here's all the switches wired up. Now if you remember from looking at the board, the blue is the fire switch, the yellow is the wattage down, and the white is the wattage up. So once you get this all wired up, we can finally move into the LiPo batteries. Okay, so here's our 2 LiPo batteries. Now each one of these is 3.7 volts and rated at 1200 milliamp hours. Now what we're going to do is wire both of these together in parallel, making it 2400 milliamp hours and still at 3.7 volts. So what I mean by wiring this in parallel is that we're going to take the 2 positive wires, connect them together. Then we're going to take the 2 negative wires and connect those together. And that's going to give us the 2400 milliamp hours. So up until this point, it didn't matter if you're using a DNA 20 or a DNA 30 chip. But once we start wiring out the batteries, there is going to be one slight difference. And that difference is the fuse. Now this is a 3 amp fuse. I'm not going to go into too much detail because that will take way too long. But basically, if you're using a DNA 20, you will want to wire up 2 fuses in parallel to the battery's positive wire. This is going to give it a 6 amp fuse. which is perfect for the DNA 20 chip. Now, if you're using a DNA 30 chip, you'll want to have 4 fuses wired in parallel, giving it a 12 amp fuse. So 2 for DNA 20, 4 for DNA 30. So the first thing that we want to do with these batteries is stick them together. Now we're going to do that with just some double-sided tape. So I'm just going to place a strip of the double-sided tape just down the center. Then place the next battery on top. And press them together gently. So now that tape should hold it in place. Then you want to cut these connectors off, leaving about 1 inch of wire. Okay, now you need to be very careful with these LiPo batteries. So once you get these wires cut off, do not touch the negatives and the positives together. Alright guys, so this is what I mean by wiring the batteries in parallel. So we have the 2 positive wires coming out of the LiPo batteries, each one going into a separate fuse, right? So each one going into a separate fuse. Then on the other side of the fuse, the other leg, that's when they all connect together. So it's basically 2 into 1. So this is going to be your positive lead. Now it's going to be the same thing for the negative side. The 2 negative wires, the black wires, going in to 1. So 2 into 1. And this is going to be your new negative wire. Also, I've taped the ends with electrical tape because we're going to put these batteries off to the side and come back to them later. So if you're using a DNA 30, this is what your wiring is going to look like. So you have the 2 positive wires from the battery, each wire going into 2 fuses. Then on the other side, all the fuses connect into 1 wire. This is going to give you the 12 amp fuse. So again, it's 2 into 1. Okay, and to charge our LiPo batteries, we have an Evolve micro USB charger, but all we need to do is for now just wire up the negative and positive terminals. Okay, so there you go. Now just put this off to the side. We got one last connection that we need to solder, and that's the 510 top cap. So this is the 510 top cap that I will be using. This base right here is the negative, and the pin is the positive. So I'm going to solder the red positive wire to this pin and the black negative wire to the base. Now you can separate this to make it a little bit easier for you. And I'm most likely going to take off this screw, because if I take off this little screw, it gives me a perfect spot to put the wire. Now that I hooked up the top cap, I did make one small change to that positive pin. Now if you can notice, I did make a slit in that pin, and I did this so that I can adjust that pin from the top. Now this is going to make changing atomizers a lot easier. But now that I have everything wired up, let's review everything that we've done. Okay, so here's everything that we've done so far. We've wired up the top cap, the fire switch, the up switch, the down switch, and we also have the charging port and the batteries. So all we have to do now is place everything inside the enclosure and then connect the wires together. Okay, so here's the enclosure that I showed you earlier. This is the Hammond's 1590A enclosure. Now as you can see, I did a swirl paint finish on this box. Now if you're interested in knowing how I did this, I do have a tutorial video which I'll place a link down below. What I've also done is made a new cover out of the lexan glass. Now this is going to replace that aluminum cover that came with this box. All I did was place the box down on the glass, traced around it with a Sharpie, and then cut it out with a Dremel tool. So now we're going to have a clear cover for our DNA display. What we need to do now is epoxy the top cap and the switch onto this box. And I'm just using a 2-part epoxy. Now you also want to break off a small piece of that Lexan glass. Now we're going to epoxy our USB charger onto this glass piece. From there, we're going to epoxy both of these to the bottom of our enclosure. And I'll show you what I mean later on. Okay, so I have all the parts epoxied onto the case. I have the 510 top cap, the fire, up and down switches, and also the micro USB charger. Now, like I showed you earlier, I epoxied the charger onto the lexan glass prior to epoxying it onto the case. The reason I did that is that it will lift the charging port up and also ensure that none of the connections on the charging port will touch the aluminum case. So now that we have all that epoxy, we could place in the batteries. I'm going to first apply some double-sided tape to the back of the battery, then position the battery into the case, just like that. Then we're going to take the DNA chip and tape the screen onto this component. Now I'm going to do that with double-sided tape as well. But before doing that, you want to route the wires on the board appropriately so that they're facing the correct direction of the components you're going to be soldering to. So once you have the screen taped to the board, we're going to place this entire DNA chip onto this battery. So what you want to do now is just place some more double-sided tape to the back of the chip, then stick it onto the battery. Okay, so once you have everything in place, you can now start connecting the wires. Just connect the yellow to yellow, white to white, blue to blue, and so on. Feel free to trim the wires if needed. Oh yeah! So I have all the wires hooked up and everything is functioning properly. The up switch works, as well as the down switch. Now I don't have an atomizer hooked up, but if I click the fire switch, that also works. So if you like the open look with the wires exposed, you can just go ahead and screw down the clear cover, and you'll be pretty much done with this project. But another option is to actually tint this clear cover. Now this will give it a nice smoked out look, and I'll show you what that looks like right now. And I'm going to tint the clear cover with some VHT nightshades. I'm just going to apply about 2 to 3 coats. Alright, so here's everything put back together with the tinted clear cover. Now as you can see, it looks really nice. It just gives it a very professional look. Now you can still see the display. Now if you do decide to go with a tinted cover, you're going to want to remove the factory tint off the DNA display. Another step that you can take is to replace these screws with black ones. It's going to give it an even cleaner, more professional look. But all the functions still work. The wattage down, wattage up, and the fire. Now I don't have an atomizer hooked up, so that's why it's saying check atomizer. But other than that, this project is done. All that's left to do is vape on it. So this just performs fantastic. Now there are a few footnotes and recommendations I'd like to give you. Number 1, wires. Now I highly recommend that you use stranded wires. Now in this video I used a solid core wire, and the only reason that I did that is because that's what I had on hand. But if you use stranded wires, it's going to be a lot more flexible and just a lot easier to work with. Number 2, batteries. Now in this project I decided to go with LiPo batteries, but you can use any batteries that you like. Just know that if you use different type of batteries, you may need to rearrange the layout of this device. For example, you may not be able to have this nice little screen up in front. Number 3, the top cap. Now I decided to go with a stainless steel top cap that I took off an old mechanical mod. Just note that stainless steel is extremely difficult to solder to. It's doable, but difficult. So if you have any hesitation, I would recommend just going with the standard 510 connector or choosing a top cap of a different material. Number 4, the enclosure. Now I went with the Hammond's 1590A enclosure for this project. Now most Hammond boxes come with a slight slant to each side. Now what this means is that if you don't do anything about that, your atomizers may sit slightly slanted. If you're okay with that, then no big deal. But if that bugs you, then you could do what I did and sand each side flat until it's perfectly squared. This gives me a nice flush mounted atomizer that sits straight up and down. And finally, number 5, credit. Now I can't take full credit for the design of this box mod. The plans for this box mod has been floating around the internet for quite some time. Now I did change some things and do a few custom touches, but a big shout out goes to Mamu for making this design available to the public. But overall, this was really fun to make, and it's not as difficult as it may seem. Now hopefully this video will help you along the way, and if you have any interest of making your own box mod, I would highly encourage it. Now I do have a few more tutorials coming up. I'm planning on doing an OKR box mod tutorial like the Duke and the Hexome, but also an SX350 mod that goes up to 50 watts. But until then, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Do you have an old copper or brass mod that you want to give a fresh new look? Doing a forced patina may be the answer for you. With just a few household items, you can take your boring old mod and turn it into something truly unique.